Hey everybody, my name's Ray. This is how we buy milk in Canada, and you're watching Qlik Branch. Let's do some coding. All right, so we've got a React app created and connected to the engine. Now we want to actually do some loading of data from the engine itself. So we're going to start. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull some images in that we're going to be using later on. So let me grab these images and put them into our assets folder. So the first thing that we're looking at right here is we are looking at an SVG file, and this is just going to be a symbol, an icon that people will click on when they see a movie in order to open up more details. And then the other thing we're looking at here is a placeholder image. So with our data, we've got posters for each of the movies, but it is possible that some of those movies don't actually have a poster associated to them in our data. So we want like a placeholder image to replace that, so it's not just a blank area in our app. So now that I've got those images in place, the next thing I want to do is I want to update my Enigma service and give myself the ability to actually get data from the engine. So what I want to do is I want to create a function called getData, and it's going to take two properties. The first one is going to be a properties object, and this properties object will be the hypercube definition that gets sent to the engine to actually create the hypercube that we're looking for. And then the next thing we're going to get passed in is a callback. And the callback, it's a function that we want to call whenever an update happens to the hypercube or the session object that we're creating. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to create a session object. And what this session object will be is it will be an object that contains all the information. Create session object that contains all the information about the hypercube that we're requesting. So we do this .document.create session object, and we pass in our hypercube definition. The next thing we want to do is we want to see if they actually passed in a callback. Then we're going to say that when the changed event happens on the session object, we want to call the callback, passing through the session object itself. And then finally, we are going to just do another quick callback, call to that callback, so that whatever happens gets executed right away. And we'll just return the session object at the same time. So this is our getData function, and it takes in a hypercube property, hypercube definition object, and a callback function. Here we create the session object from the document that we've loaded in our init when we opened up our app. And then if we have a callback, we want to say that when the changed event is fired on that session object, we want to call that callback function. So that's all that we're going to need in terms of our connection to the engine itself. The next thing we want is our hypercube definition. Now, I haven't gone into a whole lot of explanation as to what a hypercube is. We actually have a primer video on our channel about what a hypercube is. So I will leave a link to that primer video so that you can learn about hypercubes. Today, we're just going to go through an actual hypercube definition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually create a JSON file, because all hypercube definitions are passed through the WebSocket as a JSON. So we want a JSON object. And the first thing we need to give is a QInfo. And a QInfo is required by the engine. We want to pass in a type, and this type we're just saying it's a table, and we want to pass in an ID. And so the ID is the ID of the object itself, or the hypercube that we're creating. And we're just going to say, let's see, movie table. Perfect. So that's the first thing that we need. The next thing that we're going to do is we're just going to put labels true. And then we're going to create our actual Q hypercube def. The first thing we want to pass in is our dimensions. And actually, in this example that we're doing here, we're not actually going to have any measures because all we're looking for is information about all the individual movies. We're not looking for any actual aggregation of any data. So for each dimension, the Q dimensions is an array. And for each dimension, we need a new object. And that object is going to have a QDef definition. And that QDef is going to require a field defs property, which is an array of the field that we're actually looking for in that dimension. So there's a few that we're going to want here. We'll start with the movie title. Is the first one that we're going to look for. Another one that we want is the content rating. Next one is the title year. After that, we're looking for the director name. And all of these are fields that we have listed in our actual app. If you look at Catwalk and you see all the field names, these are what we're plugging in here, that the fields that we want in our actual hypercube. So we want our actor 1 and our actor 2 and our actor 3. Normally there's a lot of keyboard shortcuts you could do to just copy and paste things around, but I'm trying to make sure that I go through each one so you see what I'm doing and you don't get lost if you're not used to a lot of the shortcuts that are available with Visual Studio Code. And we want the poster URL because we want to be able to show our posters. So that is our list of dimensions that we're looking for. The next and another required one for our hypercubes that's very important is Q initial data fetch. And what this is the information that the hypercube is looking for in terms of what we want, what specific data amounts we're looking for. So it usually has 4 properties. There's QTop and QLeft. So QTop and QLeft are where in your hypercube you're looking to get this data, which is a little iffy to try to explain really quickly. So I'm not going to do it at this point. When we get to pagination, I'll go more into what QTop and QLeft are all about. Right now, we're going to leave them at 0, 0 because we want to be at the very top left of our hypercube. The next thing we want is Q height, and Q height is basically relative to the number of rows, essentially, that we're looking for from our hypercube. And then Q width is the width of our hypercube that we want it to be. And this is generally, you add the number of dimensions and the number of measures together. And this usually equals out your Q width. Now you can have a smaller Q width than the number of dimensions and measures that you're looking for. Sometimes if you want to do pagination on a left-right axis as opposed to a row top-down axis, then you would adjust your Q width to something different. So after our Q initial data fetch, the next thing we're going to show is our Q suppress 0 property. And what this is essentially, do we want the hypercube to suppress 0 valued fields? We don't, but we do have no problem with the hypercube suppressing missing fields. So we're just going to say true on that one. So there is our hypercube definition, and this is probably the longest and more convoluted thing in terms of just creating your list for what you're looking for from the engine itself. Once we have that, we want to create a new component that's going to show off all of the different features of each movie. So we're going to create a new folder called movie. In here, we're going to want an index JavaScript file, and we're going to want a CSS file. So let's say movie.css. Perfect. So in our movie here, the first thing we're going to want is our actual CSS file. So we're going to import that there. We're also going to want our React, and here we're also going to use the use state because we want to keep track of whether or not we are showing the details of the movie. So in our final product, you're going to see we'll have that plus icon. They click on that and it opens up a dialog or a modal for that movie. And so we want to use state to determine whether or not that dialog is going to be open. We want to import that actual SVG file that more-info.svg that we're going to put into our component itself. And then the last thing we want is we also want to import that image of our movie placeholder /movie placeholder because we're also going to be using this inside of our component here. All right, so now we will create our component. We're going to need properties because this is going to be a component that gets its movie information passed through to it. And then from those properties, we're going to extract exactly the information that we need in order to display. So we will have our show details and our set show details, which is us using use state. And originally, we don't want the details to be shown, so we're going to say use state equals false. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set a bunch of local variables, which are going to match up with the names of variables that get passed through from our props. So we can just do this. We want our content rating, our country, our language, our director name, actor 1, actor 2, actor 3. So these are all coming in from a movie attribute that gets set over in our other component. So if we say const and then we open up these curly brackets and pass in all the variable names, what they're going to do is it's going to create all of these variables based on those names inside of the props.movie object. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of an adjustment so that all of the actors fit on the same line. It's going to look a lot nicer than trying to individually parse them all out. So what we'll do is we will do actor 1 name. So we're going to create a temporary array right here, and then we're going to filter them out based on whether or not they exist. So if they're null or empty, we don't want them to actually show up in our list. After we do a filter, then we want to join them together with commas in between. So it'll be actor 1, comma, actor 2, comma, actor 3, or just two names if only two of them, or just one name without any commas as needed. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a Qlik function that we're going to call add default source. And this will be used on a target for, basically this is going to be used on an image to make sure that we get exactly what we're looking for. So when we have our poster, we're going to pass in a URL for the poster itself, and we're going to create this function so that if an error happens with the image, which we assume means that the URL doesn't exist or the source isn't good, then we're going to assign it to the image that we've imported above. So that's our add default source function. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a toggle show details function, which is going to be very easy. All that does is that calls set show details to the opposite of what show details currently is. So whenever the button is clicked with this, it'll execute this function, which will basically show or hide the details for that individual movie. So now that we've done all that, we can actually create our component. And what we'll do here is we'll create our initial div, call it movie. And the first thing we're going to have is a poster. And here we will put our poster URL. You'll always want to add an alt attribute to your images so that people who have trouble viewing screens and are using a screen reader will be able to get details about what that image actually is. And then we say on error, we want to call the add default source. So then we want to create a div that is all of the details for our actual movie, and then we'll have an inner div which is our main details, which includes our title, movie title, and then there will also be some sub details inside of this main details div, which will be the director name and the title year. So this is the list of our main details, and then outside of our main details, we're going to have another div. See if I got that lined up right. No, I think we're sitting inside this one. And this will be the div that we use to hold all of the extra information that gets opened up when somebody clicks the plus. So we'll say right here, if show details works, then we want to add a component in. Otherwise, we want to show nothing here. And here we'll have our new div, which will be our pane, or more details pane. Okay, and then here we're going to have basically just a bunch of labels and divs. So we'll start with our content rating. And then we'll have a label for our country. Next is going to be our language. After our language is our director. And finally, we will have one for our actors. Perfect. All right, so we have all of this, and then the last thing that we want is we want our image, which is our SVG file. We say we want more details, and sorry about that. And then when someone clicks it, we want to do the toggle show details function. So this is the component overall that will take, sorry, we just got to export it. There we go. So now the movie component will be exported outside of our JavaScript file. So this is the component that we're creating. Basically, we will create each one of these create this component for each one of the movies that we're going to display in our app. And then we have the CSS here, which there's a whole lot involved in that. So I'm just going to paste that in and do a quick explanation. So we have our movie div, which is our big main div. We have our poster, which updates the image, and then our title is going to have a bigger font size. All the details are going to be displayed in a flex display. And then our more details, and a lot to do with the way that our more details pane looks, because it's going to have a little bit of a floaty look to it, which is really nice. So we added that CSS in. And you can find all of this CSS in the actual repository. And then the next thing we're going to do is we are going to hook everything together. So let's go to our main component, which originally we really had nothing in here. We're going to have to import some more stuff. So first of all, we're going to need to use our use effect again. And we also need our use state from React. So we're going to use both of these things in order to deal with a lot of stuff in terms of handling the data that comes in. So we have our main CSS. We also want our movie component. So we'll have that there. We want our Enigma service, because we want to be able to access Enigma. I keep doing single apostrophes instead of double apostrophes. It's a fun thing to have to deal with. We want our hypercube definition. So that we're going to have to get from our assets folder. Movie hypercube.json. Perfect. Yeah, so that's all we're going to need at this point. Sorry, just give me 1 second. There we go. Perfect. I've got my notes in better place now. Okay, so this is going to be in curly braces because there's a lot more happening now. We're going to define a const called height, and this is going to be the number of rows that we want from the actual system. So basically the number of movies that we're looking for. We're going to update our hypercube definition to include this number. That way, if you want to play around, or if we want to adjust things later on in terms of the number of movies that are shown, we can just change a quick thing right here, and it'll automatically update the app. So the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create some state variables. So we want our movie list, which is originally going to be an empty array. We want to hold on to the matrix that we get back, but originally that's going to be null, and we want to hold on to a list of our dimensions. This will just make stuff easier for us, both now and later on. So once we've done this, we want to create a couple of functions that are going to deal with the data that we get back in our hypercube. The first thing is we want to create the function that we are going to use as our callback function. So when we call our Enigma service.getData, we're going to pass in this function, and this is the function that's going to get executed every time the hypercube data updates. So the first thing we'll want to do is when we get our object, our session object in, it's going to be in the form of a model, and we want to get the layout from that model. So we'll do, there we go, we'll do model.getLayout. The next thing we want to do is we're going to set our dimensions. So we're going to pull our dimensions out of our layout. So layout dot autocomplete's being wonderful today. Q hypercube dot Q dimension info. And this is the information about all the dimensions that we have. And then we want to hold on to the matrix that we get back from the layout as well. So Q hypercube dot Q data pages 0.Q matrix. So layout is our basic layout object, and then all of our hypercube information is going to be inside of Q hypercube. And the main source of our data that comes out of the hypercube is within this Q matrix object that we get within the first Q data page inside of our object there. And that's all we really need. So what we're saying here in this function is every time the data inside of our hypercube changes, we want to reset the dimension information and reset the matrix information that we have locally here. Once we do that, we're going to use our useEffect hook from React. And this useEffect we only want to run when the component gets first created. So that's why we're passing in an empty array here, because an empty array will never change. So this useEffect will only ever get called once. So in this, what we want to do is the hooks are a little finicky in React in the sense that you can't directly call asynchronous functions in an asynchronous way from the function itself. So what we have to do is we have to create an inner function essentially that is an asynchronous function. So you can see right here. And then we have to call that function inside of the useEffect in order to accomplish what we want. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to take this hypercube a definition, and we are going to update that Q initial data fetch that we pulled out there, and we want the Q height to be equal to whatever our constant value right here is. Once we've done that, then we want to call our Enigma service.getData, and we want to pass in our hypercube JSON file, and we want to say that update data is our callback function. So once again, update data will be the function that will be called every time that the data updates. So we have our information that pulls in what we're looking for from the engine. Now we just need to actually get that data into our component in a displaying way. So what we'll do is we will create a new function called transform matrix. And what this function will do is we'll say that if we have a matrix here, we are going to create a movie list locally, which is a mapping of our rows inside of our matrix. And here we'll create an empty item. And the reason why we held on to our dimension information is because we're going to use that in order to build out our actual object here. So we are creating a for loop that says for each one of the dimensions in our dimension list, essentially, we are going to assign it to the same title or the same name, essentially, as the field that we have there. So what we said right here is for each one of the dimensions, item, and then this is how you do dynamic assignment of variable names in JavaScript. So we'll say item, and then the fallback title of that dimension is that text. So essentially, let's say the dimension that we're working with is our movie title, then the Q fallback title property of that dimension would be movie_title. So at this point, what we're saying is item.movie_title equals that dimension dot qtext, which is the text value of the dimension. So here we'll be saying, list item. So movie title would be the first dimension, so it would be at the 0 value. So our first column inside of our actual item is going to be movie title, and we assign that to the item, the movie title property of the item that we're creating. I hope that wasn't too confusing. So once we have that item, and I can see that I've got an error there. Yeah. So once we have that item and we've gone through and gotten all of those, we're actually going to return our movie. We're going to return one of our movie components. The key here is going to be the qtext of the first value that we have here. And the reason why we're specifying a key is because React wants you to assign a key value to each one of the looped components that the iterative components that you're creating. That way it has a way of knowing how each of these components are unique. So here it'll essentially be the movie title. The key for each one of our movie components will be the movie title itself. And then the movie information we actually want to pass for this component is the item that we've just created from the list of all the dimensions right here. Let's see what's going on. Oh, it's expecting something here that it doesn't have. And then finally, once we are done, what we want to do is we want to set the state of that movie list object to be this movie list that comes back up here. So there we go. A little bit of a typo caused an issue there. And then finally, two more things. First off, we need to create a use effect. And we need to essentially say we want to call our transform matrix function here every time that our matrix changes. So use effect will keep an eye on this matrix property, and whenever it gets updated, it will call our new transform function and create our new movie list, which will then output here into our main. And let's correct this small error here where it says expected and instead saw an expression. I guess it's because I'm only using one value. No. Let's try that. Okay, and now we need to just adjust inside of our movie here. We named that wrong. Excellent. So it also says that we didn't actually call this. So now we're calling this hypercube function, which will do all the hypercube stuff. And if we look over at our app, oh, we see a break in our error. Let's do a refresh to actually get, no, create session object. I'm wondering if there is an error. Let's take a look at this and say, so we have our session created, and this create session object is happening before we actually have the document open. So we are probably running into a race condition here. And if I just look, I think it's probably that I need to make sure that the document is actually loaded. So let's check our app and see. Yeah, so if we look over at our app, see how we're rendering this regardless? This isn't something that we should do because we're not sure whether or not it's initialized yet. So we'll do this and say if it's initialized, then show this stuff. Otherwise, we don't want to show anything. We can actually put just an empty div tag here like this. Let's try it again. Perfect. So now you see that we had the same thing before, which was our blank, except now we actually have our movies here. You can see each one of the movies, and it's a long list of about 100 movies. And you can see that there's 4 right here. I've been showing a weird download the whole time. You can see that there's 4 right here. When we click on our SVG, we get that movie information that we were looking for. And let's try updating that height property that we created here. Let's say we only want to show three movies. So we'll update that, and you can see now there's only 3 movies that show. Put it back to 100 because who wants to look at only 3 movies? So now we've got our list of movies showing in our app. So the key things to take away from this is that what we've done is in our Enigma service, we've created a session object, and when the event, the changed event is fired on that session object, we've created a callback function that will update the data on our front end with the new data that's being sent to us through this object. So we have our getData function here, and then in our main, we say getData, we pass in our hypercube definition and our update function that then calls the layout and then updates our data locally on the front end and then transforms it into the files that we're looking for. So that's it. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe and update your notifications so you get notified when the next video comes out. Please feel free to join the Slack, the Qlik Branch Slack. We'll leave a link down in the description, and that gives you access to our Qlik Branch community, which is the big community of developers of all things that are Qlik and Qlik Sense related. Please visit developer.qlik.com. We've got a bunch of cool projects that our community has built and some knowledge items to help you further in your process of developing within Qlik. And we'll see you in the next video.